In the last video, we looked at how to read and write data files that happen to be located on your computer. But if you have access to the internet, you can also pull data files directly off the web. So if you have, for example, in this last case, we had a data file that was that we pulled off the web. So rather than going to that website, downloading it, reading it in, we can just pull it straight out of the website. So I've got that text file from this web address. So if I go over to my data files here and go into my daily sunspot number and I click on text, it's going to actually open up a web address that you see right here that has access to that text file. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that that web address instead of downloading the file to our computer. Now, the one thing you'll notice that's different about this file is the data is exactly the same. It's just separated by white space instead of by semicolons, but we'll show you how to deal with that. So let me go back here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import a new library, and that library is called urllib. And so this is a library that's going to allow us to access and parse web addresses. Once I do that, then I'm going to make a variable called URL, and I'm going to put into it the web address surrounded in quotes that I just went to. So that's the web address that gives access to that text file. So that's just a string that I've declared, much like we declared our file last time, our file name last time. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to point my notebook at that file so that I can read through it. So I'm going to call this web file, and I use the urllib library, and I request a URL open. And then I put the string in there. So what this does is it uses a function called URL open that opens this and requests the data from it. And all of that's underneath the urllib library. And if everything goes well, if that file exists on the internet, it's going to point this variable web file at the top of that file, just like it pointed the other variable at the top of the file on your computer. Everything else is identical. So we go ahead and we create our array of dates or our list of dates to hold the numbers of dates, and then we do the number of sunspots. Then we do the standard deviations, and this time I say for line in web file because that's what I'm pointing to. And then I'm going to split out the data. Now here's where it's a little bit different because I'm going to split out on white space. And for white space, I can just leave that blank. And so if I print data there, what you should see is this column of data right here. Now this little b here is going to go away when we cast these things to floats. So let's go ahead and finish our processing and watch what happens here. So let's go ahead and do our check if data 4 is greater than 0 and data 5 is greater than 0, and those have to be floats. I'm going to say float and float. So that's just checking to make sure that my numbers and standard deviations are greater than 1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my appending again. I can do dates, append, so everything is exactly like what we did before. Say float data 3, because we do the 4th column, 5th column, and 6th column. And then I do numbers dot append float data 4. And then I do standard deviations dot append float data 5. And then finally, I'm going to close that. I say web file dot close. Okay. So let's go ahead and run that, make sure that doesn't give me any errors. All right, I've got an error here because I misspelled standard deviations. Okay. So now let's print out what we have here. So if I print out the dates, then I should have a list of dates. So you can see that I'm printing out the dates there. If I print out the numbers, It takes a little bit longer to access the data off of the internet just because it has to negotiate and download the file. But there we go. We've got the numbers right there. But I hope you can see that the other than these first two lines, pretty much everything is identical. So that's how you get data from either files on your computer or off of the internet into your notebook. If you put all of this in one cell and then execute it, then those variables are available in other cells, and you don't have to rerun that. So if you don't want to rerun this every single time, you can just put that in a separate cell, and then it'll be a lot faster. It won't actually do this URL request every single time. So that's something that you can execute while we're doing that. And in fact, while we're here, why don't I just show you kind of a handy way of importing files once you've got this working so that you can access it later on in your files. We're going to use something called a function, right? So a function is a block of code that we can reuse. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say, I'm going to define a function, and I'm going to call this function read file. And the argument of this function is going to be a URL. Okay, so this URL is going to be passed to the rest of this function. So I'm going to take this out for the time being. And then I'm going to just tab all of this over. So all of this stays the same. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return dates, numbers, and standard deviations. So what this does now is I've made a function that if I pass it a URL, it'll open it, make my containers, read the data file in, close it, and then pass these back to me. And if I execute that, nothing's going to happen because that is now a function that hasn't been called by the computer. To call it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that my dates, numbers, and standard deviations are going to be equal to read data URL. And all I need to do is tell it what that URL is, and I can put in what I had before, which was this string that points to that data file. So what this is doing here is it's saying define this URL and then call this function and return dates, numbers, if I can spell correctly, and standard deviations. And if I return that, what did I do wrong? Oh, read file. Whoops. Okay, there we go. If I do that, now my dates and everything else are loaded into those lists. And the handy thing about that is now, as long as I'm writing, or as long as I'm reading a data file that has the same format, I never have to rewrite this code again. So here's your first reusable bit of code for all of your sunspot data analysis. We can just go ahead and use that over and over and over again. Okay, so that's how you read files from your computer and from the internet, and also a little bit about how you use functions in Python. Next up, we're going to start on some data analysis and looking at how to visualize data using the matplotlib libraries. We'll see you over there.